Hello, dragonflies. Many of us have the goal of loosening up and not painting so tight. So today I have a little exercise for you that might help with that. Here I have some examples, a couple of little bottles, and also on the left-hand side I used my little spray bottle to create a little sketch of that. And as you can see, these are quite loose. I didn't draw anything ahead of time, and in fact, I worked on top of some previous work. So here I have one of my little test sheets that I keep off to the side so I can practice brush strokes or test colors. And there are just a bunch of random marks, and I'm going to work right on top of this. So here's my subject. I have a little milk bottle, and I'm not going to draw it ahead of time, and I'm not going to be too worried about getting it exact. I'm just going to use it as a general idea because after all, I'm trying to loosen up here. So the temptation, since I haven't drawn anything with a pencil, is to get in with my brush and start using my brush as a pencil and drawing the outlines. And that's what I want to avoid doing here because that's taking me down the same little path as if I were to draw everything out and I'm going back towards painting tight. So instead, I'm going to just use my brush to define some of the shapes that I see. And I'll try to use brush strokes that mimic some of those shapes. So maybe a little stroke like that. That looks like there's a little threading on the neck of this bottle. So I'll suggest that. And then maybe some of the little reflections in the glass going down one side, and a little suggestion of part of the bottom of the bottle. And then maybe on this side I'll paint, do a little negative painting and paint the outside, what's not the bottle, background, and use that to help define that side of the bottle. And we'll just continue that around the corner a little bit. And now maybe suggest a little of the darker areas on the threading on the neck of the bottle, and maybe a little of the front side, suggest that a bit. So I'm working all around. I'm not working just starting on one side and going all the way around the outline. I'm looking around for places that I can add a brush stroke or two and give the viewer a bit more information. So let's see, maybe over on this side we'll do a little threading there, and then let's define that left edge of the bottle a bit more. Maybe we'll do that by suggesting a little bit of a line, and we'll leave a little light in between, and that kind of gives the sense of the thickness of the glass there, sort of the little bit of refraction of the light on that side. And we'll just continue that down a little bit. And maybe just another stroke suggesting some of the little refracted areas, some little dark shadows here, kind of going around the neck of that bottle and over the shoulder. Some of the things that you see in glass, a lot of times we think of glass as clear, but a lot of times there are some fairly dark reflections and refracted areas in the glass. Now we'll go back and restate that background to bring the bottle out a bit more. So even though I already painted that area once, I'm not committed to that. I can come back and make some adjustments. I'm going to bring the shoulder of that bottle out a little bit and reshape it as I add my darker color. Kind of reshape that top edge, give it more of the shape that I want it to have. And then maybe let's continue some of that dark over on the other side. Kind of suggest a shadow going back behind the bottle maybe, and also again leaving that little bit of light along the edge of the bottle, which gives it the sense of the thickness of the glass. Now that's pretty wet, so let's set this aside and take one that's already dry, and I'll show you the next thing that you can consider doing. So I'm going to take a piece of plastic and a natural sponge. The plastic here is could use a piece of quilt template plastic, or just scrounge around in your recycling and find a piece of plastic that you can cut an edge on. So I take my sponge, I get it damp, and I dry it off so I don't have drips all over the place. And I take my plastic and place it along the edge where I want to make some adjustments. So I'm going to put it right along that right edge of the bottle, and I'm going to do a little bit of lifting right here to lighten up that little bit of light that's falling behind the bottle. I kind of like that, and I'd like to accentuate that. So I'm doing a little bit of rubbing and a lot of blotting. I'm trying not to damage the surface of the paper. So now that area is lightened up, and I kind of like that. So I think maybe I'll rinse my sponge and do a little bit more. And remember, you can always come back and lift more. So my philosophy with this sort of thing is do a little bit, check it and see what you think, and then decide if you want to do more, because it's easier to just lift a little more than it is to go back and forth. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's do some of that on the other side here. We'll make it look like that light is falling through the bottle, and maybe a little patch of light cast on the wall behind. Notice that I try to sort of push away from the plastic, because if you scrub toward the plastic, you may push pigment right along that edge of the plastic and leave a little line that you don't want. So instead of pushing towards, I'm going to try to move away when I'm using my sponge to lift. And again, more blotting than scrubbing. So now we have a sense of light falling behind that bottle. And I like that. That gives me more depth, and it also kind of brings the bottle forward. I'm going to lift just a little bit off the front of the bottle itself. So now we're getting a little sense of the three-dimensionality of the bottle as well by just doing that little bit of lifting. So we pulled that bottle forward out of the background just by lifting a light behind it. So now let's come back to our first bottle. It's had a chance to dry a bit now, and let's do a little bit of the same sort of thing here. Now sometimes you want to just lift a little area, so for that I like to use a flat brush, or you could use an angle shader. I'm going to get the brush wet and blot it off so it's not drippy. And now I'll take the chisel edge of this brush and hold the brush vertically so I can use that to lift and kind of extend this white line. The bottom shape of the bottle kind of curves in there, and I'd like it to be more straight. So I'm going to extend that light area down a bit. And I don't have to do much for the viewer's eye to follow that light line. I don't have to lift it all the way back to white. That's enough to reshape that bottle because our eyes follow those edges. Now at this point, these marks in the background aren't as noticeable, but they're a little bit distracting, so let's soften them up. We'll take a damp brush, and I'm just putting some clear water down and letting that soften the paint below, and then I'm dragging that color a little bit, just getting it moving. I'm not trying to erase, I'm just trying to soften and pull a little of that color so that it blends in a bit with the things around it. And then maybe let's do a little lifting here and suggest a bit more of the reflections on the threading on the bottle. And again, see, I'm not trying to lift all the way back to white. I'm just trying to give a little bit of lightness there, and that's all you really need. Your eye catches that contrast, and you start to see some form. Let's see, let's do maybe a little. You can do this with a round brush too. Sometimes that's easier to make the shape. Come on, camera, focus. Sometimes it just gets confused when I'm moving my hands around so much. Hopefully it'll settle down here soon. And I'll show you what I'm doing. You see how I was able to just give that suggestion of a little bit more light and a little bit of roundness on that side. I'm letting the water do the work. I don't have to have a stiff scrubby brush because I'm not trying to lift all the way back to white. You see how I'm able to reshape that just a little bit. So I don't have to get it perfectly the first time because I can go back and make adjustments. I'll do just a little more here. Suggest a little bit more of that threading on the top and blot. Now over here on the left side, those marks from before are a bit distracting. So again, I'm going to soften that and help bring the bottle forward by muting that and pushing back the contrast in just the same way as I did before, except I think I'll add a little color to my water here. So mostly this is clear water, and I'm bringing it over those previous brush marks and just letting the brush move a little of the color as it softens up. And you see how muting the background is starting to bring the bottle forward, but we aren't obliterating everything that's back there, and it gives an interesting little bit of texture, or the suggestion of some objects in the background kind of adds a little interest. Now that little edge between the darker background and the lighter is kind of a high contrast area, so let's also drag a little of that color. And so again, I'm just using a damp brush and dragging a little of the dry color. So I'm doing this on dry paper, so I'm not fiddling with a wet area. I'm doing it after it's dried, so I am not running a risk of really abusing the paper and giving it that overworked look. Because that's really what gives you the look of being overworked, is when you fiddle with a wet area. So when you're doing this exercise, think about having maybe more than one that you're working on, or something else that you're working on, so that you can let things dry. I'm not working in any area that's still wet. I'm working in the dry areas, and several times here you may have noticed the dissolve between one frame and the next, where I set things aside and let it dry. So be sure you do that. I've edited out the boring drying part for you so that you don't have to watch it, but it's important. So at this point you can see the shape of a bottle. It might not look exactly like the bottle that I chose, but again, I'm working on loosening up here. I have to keep reminding myself, this is not an exercise in rendering. This is an exercise in making adjustments, restating, doing a little lifting, so that I can become confident in making a mark, knowing that I can make other marks later that will help to clarify the shape. Darken that a little bit, and notice that I'm being careful not to work all the way around the whole outside, because the temptation here is, once you start on an edge with this negative painting, to just keep going around until you have a halo around the whole object. So I sort of a little rule for myself that I'm not allowed to go more than a quarter of the way around before I have to stop and go work somewhere else. That also helps me not to be working on really wet paper and give it a chance to dry in any given area. So let's continue that dark across. See how this is making the bottle come forward and feel more three-dimensional? And I didn't draw any of this ahead of time. It wasn't necessary to do that. I think I'll just soften that up a little bit. And I think I'll give just a suggestion of some of that dark showing through the glass, whatever might be going behind there, some sort of a little shadow. Now this is by no means a perfect rendering, but remember, that wasn't our goal. We were trying to loosen up, and do you see how much it changed from the start to the finish? And if I keep working on it a little bit, I could continue to refine it as I did with this little bottle. And it's nice and symmetrical. You probably wouldn't have guessed that I did that one the same way, just making little adjustments. But remember, you have to let it dry each time before you go back in and start fiddling around. Now at some point you might feel like you've got a reasonably good approximation, but you'd really like to clean up a couple of areas, and you're having a hard time getting in there with the brush and figuring out your placement and figuring out your colors and so forth. So we're going to go back in now at this point and make some planning marks. Now I'm going to use a blue marker so that you can see where I put the marks, but you could use either a pale blue watercolor pencil that would disappear, or a blue graphite pencil and make light lines. So I'm drawing dark just so you can see on the video, and I'm helping myself see the shape of that upper ellipse of the bottle, because I felt like I couldn't really quite get it with my brush without a little bit of a guideline. So now I'm giving myself some landmarks, but only in the place where I really need them. I don't have to have everything drawn ahead of time. I can just give myself some guidance right here at this stage. And that's true of any painting. You can always pick up a pencil and give yourself some planning marks anytime you're feeling a little hesitant about whether you can pull off that brush stroke, and that will allow you to make a nice juicy brush stroke without having to also worry about exactly where you're putting your brush. So I think I'll give myself some landmarks down here at the bottom too, and then I'll know where I want to put my brush strokes. So now I have some planning marks to guide me, and I will go in and restate again. And remember, this is on dry background. I'm not doing this on top of wet areas and abusing the paper. I wait until it's dry, and then I come back in. Now it looks like I'm outlining here, but I'm going to actually extend that dark area out away from the edge, so I don't just have a fat outline around my little bottle. Let's just drag that color out around the corner and kind of feather it out away from the bottle. And that little spot right there, we need to kind of clean that up, and the flat brush is kind of a nice brush for that. Just going to drag some of that color out onto the dry area next to it. And, turn the paper a little bit so I can get at that and bring it right around. And because I'm dragging that color, I get a nice graded shade there instead of a brush mark. And now maybe just a little bit more defined area here. I'm using those planning marks that I made before to help me get the shape of these little dark reflections or shadows under the threading on the upper part of the bottle, and kind of clean that up and define the shape a bit more, and maybe a little shadow here on the shoulder. Now obviously you can continue this process refining and refining and refining, but there's a point at which you'll learn more by just going ahead and starting another one. So let's move on. So last time we started on a sheet like this, where none of the color is particularly dark. But what if you wanted to work on something where you did have darker color? So for example, here we have some areas that are fairly dark, and we also have a couple of sort of rectangular shapes. So if we're going to work on top of this, we might begin by doing some lifting instead of starting with a brush stroke. So I could maybe define the left side of that bottle by using my little plastic template and just pulling a little of this color off. And so there we have a suggestion of some light colored object coming in front of that darker background. And then maybe over on the right side, let's get some of the same sorts of colors that are going in the background. Maybe on the right side, we'll do a little negative painting and define the outside edge of the bottle over there by painting the background a little darker. Now I lifted quite far down, but I don't have to be bound by that. I can make the bottom edge of my bottle be wherever I want, say right there. And then again, I'll just kind of feather out this color that I put in the background so that I'm not drawing just a fat outline all the way around. Now on the left side there, the bottom of that bottle was still wet, so you see it bled. But that's okay, I'm not going to get concerned with that. That is something that we know we can adjust later. So let's just sort of smudge this top edge, because I don't know exactly where I want to put the top of that bottle. And maybe I will just use a single brush mark for the inside of the ellipse at the top of the bottle. So that gives us a beginning, and even though I haven't done a lot yet, you can see just by doing the little bit of lifting on the left side and then a little shadowing on the right side, you can begin to see some sort of a transparent or translucent object in front of a background. So even though we haven't done very much yet, your brain is already starting to connect the dots, and even just making a few planning marks helps you to start to see where that bottle is going to emerge. So find yourself something like this test sheet that has some random marks on it. Don't start on a plain piece of paper, because that's going to give you the feeling that you have to be super careful. This has already got stuff on it, so your expectations will be lower and you'll already be on the way to loosening up. So pick a simple object or two or three and give this a try. Be sure to let things dry, so maybe work on more than one. And if you get frustrated or it's not working out too well, pick up a different one. You'll learn more by doing a lot of them and allowing yourself to have some spectacular failures than you will by trying to be so tight and precise with everything, because after all, the goal is to loosen up, right? So I hope you have fun with it, and I'll see you again next time.